Hello, 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 everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in this world. I am here with a very, very special guest today. I am here with Bram Cohen, the creator of Chia and BitTorrent. Bram, how are you today? Good afternoon.
Hey, good to be here.
I'm very happy to have you. It's an honor. You've done so much for the cryptocurrency revolution and the cypherpunk ideals, and it's an honor to have you. So I want to say again, thank you so much for all you've done for this industry, and thank you so much for speaking to me today.
Sure.
Absolutely. So let's just talk about your upbringing first. So I wanted to ask you about your upbringing that facilitated the development of your ideals surrounding decentralization and peer-to-peer networks. So Bram, what dilemmas did you perceive empirically within our society that made you decide to embark on this personal and technological journey?
It's sort of a combination of my own esoteric interests uh, and what I still think is actually useful for the world.
Mhm,
So I'm a mathematician. So
mhm,
I will spend time working on things like go first dice is something I worked on over the break, came up with a result on. Things like there are things that mathematicians find interesting and worth pursuing for their own reasons of ethereal,
mhm.
abstract beauty and such. Uh, so I like doing a lot of that. Many of those things are not of very immediate engineering import, like they're just purely abstract. Um, in terms of changing the world, it's hard to change the world,
Mhm.
and I always, have had the attitude of, well, I should do whatever I can to improve the world as much as I possibly can, just as a principle in life.
Yes.
So, so the question, and I have these very technical skills, and also, if you pursue things like going through politics or working at a big company or things like
Mhm.
that, you have to rely on other people.
Yes, yes, you do. No questions asked about that.
And there's definitely like even at like medium-sized companies, there's this weird thing where people will just kill, other projects just for their own petty reasons, having
Yeah.
no concern whatsoever for how important these projects are for them. It gets kind of sociopathic at some point when you have like a bad lawyer. It's like, oh yeah, I know this deal would avoid killing this technology that millions of dollars has been poured into and would give jobs to like a dozen people. But if it goes too well or too badly after it goes through, I personally could just be embarrassed. So it just can't be. There's really a shocking amount of that at big companies.
I'm sure.
And even worse in politics. So I could not deal with such an environment as my job. So I kind of wound up becoming an entrepreneur as a result of that. just as a result of wanting to just unilaterally do things and using the toolbox that I have at hand, which is my technical skills.
Absolutely, and I can imagine. I mean, from a corporate standpoint, unfortunately, when you start going up the corporate ladder, there it appears that there's a necessity to have this type of Machiavellian sociopathy to unfortunately succeed.
Yeah, it's this really weird thing where people are so used to it
Mhm.
that they like the image of what is a good CEO is not an image of a good CEO. It's an image of a typical CEO.
Yeah,
Like
exactly,
it's
exactly.
sort of like, well, we want to have a really good pirate ship. And it's like, well, what do all the great pirate ships have in common? Well, they all have a lot of barnacles. Okay, so let's go plant a whole bunch of barnacles on our ship to make sure that it's like a real proper pirate ship, like before we get going. Like that kind of.
No, it's a very good analogy. I mean, I completely agree with you 100% that like when I was in the corporate world and I wasn't in it for long
Mhm,
before I entered the sphere of blockchain and went to school to be an educator, you
mhm,
had this. you definitely had this lack of altruism, this notion of radical individualism in the idea of personal economic gain, almost to the point of avarice, to say the least.
Mhm.
So I agree with you 100%.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually dropped out of college because I didn't see the point.
I don't blame you. Most of the time, college is a scam. Most of the time, anyway, unless
Yeah,
you're going.
well, there's actually a movement now to stop for businesses to stop just reflexively requiring college degrees for everything because it's stupid. It's been stupid for a long time. It's against their best interest. They're disqualifying, completely reasonable candidates for this completely arbitrary thing. So some improvement in the world. I have this dream that sometime in my lifetime, it will no longer be standard that like the homeowners association will go insane on you if you don't mow your lawn.
Yeah.
That's like
One day I can hope. And, and I want to ask you, Brad, because it seems like there's this conversation over the last 5 minutes has been really focused on principles,
yeah.
ideals, and viewpoints of how the world should be
Mhm.
and not how the world is. And I think that's directly relatable to the cypherpunk notion of thought. So I want to ask you this, Bram. I
Mhm.
want to ask you about your entrance into the cypherpunk notion of thought. Like, what perspectives and beliefs aligned with your own views surrounding limited government, digitized democracy, and a stronger vision of global citizen autonomy?
Well, I'm I'm less libertarian than you probably think I am, but um, uh, well, to start with, there's just my personal skill set. So, like the first time I ever skimmed the book Applied Cryptography, which I can't recommend as a book, but it's sort of a bunch of cryptography recipes, and it all has a lot of errors in it. There's a lot of stuff that's out of date. There's a lot of problems with it as a book, but it was this very readable introduction to cryptography, and there's a whole section in there on like Kerberos style protocols. And so I was reading it, and a bunch of the protocols it gives have bugs in them. And so at the time, this was long before there were real cryptographic proofs, where people didn't even know what the cryptographic proofs should be. Now we know they're all reductions, but at the time there was no such thing. You just eyeballed stuff. So I found some significant fraction of the protocols with bugs in them, maybe like half or something. I could just look at it and tell you what the bug was. And I had a conversation, it was sort of years long with a friend of mine about this, that I was like, look, cryptography proofs don't mean anything because the cryptographic proof is just as likely to be buggy as a human, eyeballing it for problems is. Again, this was before real reductions. Even with real reductions, it's still possible to screw these things up. Back then, this was not a totally insane position to take. And after a while, my friend explained to me two things. Number one, first of all, often in the attempts to make a proof, people would find a bug, and the bug was legitimate. So that's definitely useful to do that exercise. So if you find anything like a proof, you at least failed to find some bug, right? And the other thing, he's like, Bram, most people can't do that trick. Can't just like eyeball it and give you a pretty good guess as to whether it's okay. And to this day, I have not really learned the modern techniques for doing these things right. I just kind of eyeball stuff, and I work with other people who actually know how to do real analysis of things. But I've always been much more of I'm much better at finding constructions and counterexamples than I am at proving stuff, just in general. It's just the way I am. Yes. So my personal skill set, I just happen to be quite good at cryptography. And I was, a programming prodigy when I was younger. There's a lot of
Speaks volumes.
yeah. Well, there's a lot of people who are like good hackers, although they usually, or not most of the time anyway, aren't they? More than half the time, they're not super great at theory. They're good at cranking out code. But and then there's people who are good at theory are usually not super great at cranking out code. And I'm kind of I'm pretty good at both. So to people who are good at theory, I seem like I'm very good at hacking, and to people who are good at hacking, I seem like I'm very good at theory. I can't claim to be the best at either. There are definitely people who can beat me easily at them.
An amalgam of both worlds.
Yeah. So somewhere on the convex hull of skill. But in terms of things to do, like I was saying before, if you want to write code, you just sit down and you write it. You could just go ahead and summarily do this. So it offers this like very straightforward path to making things happen with no budget. If you can just figure out what can you do that will actually accomplish something. Usually that means what can you do that will be useful to someone, so that it meets a need of theirs and it is usable to them. Mm-hmm. Once in a great while, there are things that you can just do just for you, like algorithmic trading or something like that. But I could never really get into like studying the infantile obsessions of the marketplace, right? Like if you do something, if you write some like trading algorithms or something like that, you could potentially make a lot of money. And back when I was younger, it was much easier to make a lot of money doing that. The markets were much less efficient, and much more rudimentary statistical approaches did great actually back then. But I just didn't find it interesting as a thing to do. And even if you make a whole bunch of money, so what?
Exactly. Yeah, I agree with you 100% on that.
You've made markets marginally more efficient, but mostly you just pocketed that money yourself. And maybe you could, donate that money in some way that is good for the world, although that's easier said than done. But if we want to get into specifics of like things that the world needs, right? The world needs, well, obviously with BitTorrent, I'm like, hey, screw copyright, man. Now, I mean, it's kind of funny because there's much less of an anti-copyright movement now, or well, it's complicated. So there's much less of an anti-copyright movement on like movies and things like that now than there used to be. But a lot of that is because they caved. That it used to be that a lot of movies just were not available online for any price with any type of experience whatsoever. And a copyright holder has no obligation to be even vaguely reasonable. They can become as insane as they want. They can just say, no, nobody can use this for anything, for any reason, just because I feel like it. So in the heyday of piracy, that was the problem. Was like there was this in the early days of the internet. People forget that it was assumed that it was reasonable to just say that any reasonably professional-looking work must be copyright infringing.
Right.
Just by default, as if this was a reasonable policy to have. Just online sites just were not allowed to have professional looking stuff on them because it was all copyright infringing, which is an insane assumption to make. Like that's not a good proxy for anything. Copyright law says no such thing. But they caved, and you can get movies on services now that are okay, at least there are reasonably consistently some kind of legal experience available, although
right.
It's not great or anything. But when I was younger, I had more of a let's take down the man kind of a
anti-establishment. Yep.
Yeah, although it's funny now because like copyright is becoming increasingly kind of archaic over time as the costs of making digital works continue to plummet. and actually like games like ever decreasingly rely on copyright. There's some online component, and that's what they really use to get you to actually pay. And then the cultural relevance of movies continues to just drop over time for a variety of reasons, because there's so many of them made, people can't watch all of them, and if you want to have a cultural reference, it's much easier to just have like a meme image. And people can see lots of those and remember them easily instead of having to watch a whole movie just to remember the 2 references that people ever make to
it. You have a 2-hour film. Exactly.
Yeah. And then there's also just a bunch of commercial pressures that for a variety of reasons movies these days are very like inoffensive and meant for a very broad international audience. So anyway, that aside, I'm happy to have nothing to do with the entertainment industry anymore. Like, it's just really glad to be out of that one.
So then I want to ask you on that topic of like being able to get out of the entertainment industry and being able to understand principles and notions of what needs to change in this world. You created BitTorrent, and
Yeah.
since the inception of BitTorrent in 2001, how do you believe BitTorrent has changed how we interact with file sharing and streaming online? Like, what issues did you see with pre-existing software such as Napster that needed to be rectified? And why do you believe BitTorrent has such a large user base? Like 15
well, that's it. Well, there's two things. There's a
Sure.
usability thing, and there's a just a technology thing. So
Absolutely.
in terms of usability, you know, the minimum viable product wasn't really a term of art at the time, but having had extensive experience in the software industry, I was very familiar with it as a concept. It's like, get something working, ship it. Yeah, just go. And so I decided to make something that very narrowly did peer-to-peer downloading. And it is so narrowly focused on that you can plug it into whatever. It's just a generically useful thing. And then the other thing is just from a technology standpoint, it does something very specific, which is you can start uploading parts of a file before you're even done downloading it. And I guess it also authenticates the contents of the file by checking hashes on top of that, which was unfortunately kind of novel at the time. It's really frustrating, the deployment of technology, because a lot of banks will have like a blockchain project. And okay, well, what does blockchain mean? Like, what is this word, right? Like, and a blockchain, because it's perceived as a good word, people want to apply it to whatever they're doing, which has watered down its meaning massively over time. Yes. So generally speaking, these days, if a bank says, "Oh, we have our blockchain project," that generally means like, "Oh, well, we're actually using secure hashes to make references in our data structures now." And it's like, okay, yeah, that's great that you're doing that. That's actually a huge improvement, but you should have done that, 30 years ago.
Yeah, I wish people learned.
Yeah.
But they
are. Yeah, there's really nothing stopping that from happening a long time ago. And it's really like a lot of what I'm doing right now are doing things that are like really, really basic, like things that have like really almost nothing to do with even blockchains. It's just like basic security 101 kind of processes. And it's just starting with the basics.
Hey man, basics lead to the, I guess you could say, the society we have garnered today. I mean, we don't start in complexity, we start in simplicity, and as it grows and continues to grow into the technologies we see today. But what I find that maybe that definitely you have a lot more intuition and values on these particular principles surrounding the cypherpunk zeitgeist. I wasn't around in the early days of the cypherpunk zeitgeist, and I want to ask you, Bram, as the creator of BitTorrent and an early cypherpunk, do you believe the principles of the cypherpunk era have lost their way, specifically within the realm of blockchain and cryptocurrency? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, so there's a question: what does cypherpunk mean? And broadly speaking, it's using building of technology towards social and political ends.
Yes.
Right? And somewhat, this is just a march of technology thing. Technologies continue to get built, right?
Yes.
And a bunch of things that were extremely actually controversial in early cypherpunks have become extremely uncontroversial today. There was this idea that people should not be allowed to have good encryption, right? And even like good authentication, and that it was critically necessary for like law enforcement to be able to break anything, which is, like really optimizing for one very specific edge case over something that's really very broadly applicable. And now, of course, that battle is over. Like these days, well, like most hard drives are encrypted and they don't even tell you.
Right.
And then the vast majority of internet connections are encrypted as well.
Yes.
To the point where they're seriously talking about browsers just literally not even supporting unencrypted connections anymore. And this is viewed as a matter of like, as an important matter of national security, actually. That would be very, very bad to not have this. And this is the mainstream view. This is not like out there at all. And so that battle is over. That's one. It's done with. It took longer than it should have, but that's, that's done. With cryptocurrencies, there's, it's weird, right? Like, so I think like doing artificial intelligence is not a cypherpunk thing. It's just, for the sake of argument, because
of course,
cypherpunk stuff needs to have some cryptography somewhere in it to actually be cypherpunk. But it's weird because in artificial intelligence, the justifications of everything are just hand-wavy bullshit. But that said, they're like, the output of it is very, very tangible and useful, like really, really impressive stuff that make a very meaningful difference to people, like right. In not obscure ways. Where in crypto, everything is like super nailed down, or should be. I mean, there's massive billion-dollar hacks just because it isn't, but everything is very nailed down, has lots of incentive to make things actually very high quality and well engineered and yada yada yada. But the actual social utility of it is often quite dubious. And the things that many of the things that are the most promising are the least sexy, the things that people get least excited about. And for me, it's like, hey guys, I've had this dream. I always going back to like when I was in high school, I was in New York City. I was on math team at Stuyvesant. It was very natural life path for me would have been to bother getting good grades in high school, go to Harvard, come back, make bank on Wall Street. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
I was having none of it because I hated the finance industry, and I decided at a young age, I was having none of this, and I decided I'm never going to work in finance. I'm never going to be an executive.
No, I can imagine how that felt. I mean, as an individual, excuse me, who actually, I also grew up in, I'm also in New York myself, so I really understand where you're coming from that respect.
Yeah.
And you bring up a very good point about cryptography, and I think that it sets a precedent. And unfortunately, back in the day, I remember reading in a book one day that the DOJ basically said cryptography was a weapon against national security.
Yeah, which is the exact opposite of what they say today, because that's insane.
Yeah.
But so where I was going with this is there's this goal of getting into finance, like the obvious goal. Like I was saying before about how I don't want to work on things where you could just be told no, where people can just ignore. There's this basic thing of, hey guys, how about if payment authentication use public key cryptography? Can that be a thing? Can we do that? Is it like, and obviously, if the world were not insane, like anyone near the space would just be losing their minds that it's the 2020s and we haven't been doing this for a decade.
Yeah.
Like, this is crazy. But the finance industry, they don't care. They're fine. So that's a problem. So to my mind, there's these unsexy things of just make payments. Just get just basic payments done better. And then on top of that, there's smart money. And it's like, well, what is smart money? It's like, well, for starters, how about we have better custody arrangements, right? Like when you use a bank, there are these services the bank provides to you about how, well, you can only move out this amount of money at once, and implicitly things can be reversed and blah, blah, blah. There's a bunch of rules around these things. And there's no transparency or end user control of these things whatsoever. But this is a security service that the bank is providing you. But if you're doing it, using a cryptocurrency, in principle, it should be possible to do these things much, much better with complete end user control and transparency. Unlike, say, using Bitcoin, which feels like moving around suitcases full of $100 bills. And that's just a basic thing, right? Like just simple arrangements of like, hey, how about we make it so I use my wallet, but I can only pull out at a certain rate, and if I want to pull out faster than that, I got to get my backup key, right? Like, or how about we have something where there's a multi-sig wallet, and we have an arrangement where if a certain number of keys want to do something and a larger number of keys don't, then the larger number of keys wins, right? And if there's equal number of keys that are fighting it out, they're at a deadlock until someone manages to cough up another key. Like, okay, cool, that sounds reasonable. But this is not done. This is something that we're working on, is like bespoke stuff, because it's not like I had to figure out that this is the thing that should be done, is like your basic functionality in rekeyable multi-sig wallets. So that's so this is all very frustrating.
I can imagine.
Yeah, and so I'm working on really, really basic stuff, and often I get unnerved. Like, wait, aren't we working on things that are so basic that the rest of the world is ahead of us here? It's like, no, they're not. They're really not, because there was an Onion headline many years ago about during the beginning of the Great Recession. It said, Americans protest to Alan Greenspan, demand another bubble to invest in. Particularly with the last week, where Alan Greenspan, although he's still alive, is definitely haunting the Federal Reserve right now.
Well, it's a good point to raise, especially with the fact that we're watching the legacy finance banking system in numerous different ways collapsing before our eyes. We have Silicon Valley.
Well, actually, so here's where I'm a lot less libertarian than you might think I am. So the legacy banking system is doing a lot better than it was historically. So in the 1900s, there were these banking crises on the scale of the Great Recession that happened every 10, 15 years or so. It was horrible. So eventually it was figured out that you can't trust bankers, right? Like someone, if you talk to bankers, they're not going to say this in so many words, but implicitly the message is the number one thing that you can do to increase value is to figure out more sophisticated methods of obfuscating leverage. That is like the goal of banking is to do that. The incentives for them are to do this. If you're a CEO of a bank, right, and you go, okay, well, how do I make more money? It's like, I know, I'll increase the leverage. And you increase the leverage, you make more money. That's the way this works. And this works great until the day it doesn't. But whatever, you're just out of job. You go find another one. In the meantime, you were a genius and you increase the bank's revenues by like 50%. So you just pay yourself 10% of that. And now you're rich and deserved it, right? So after the Great Depression, very strong regulations were put in place to reduce the amount of leverage that banks could possibly have. And that worked great until the rules started getting loosened up and banks got really good at doing these like futures and stuff and just dumping all their risk into that. And then it happened again. Everyone was over leveraged and boom, everything goes bad. And so what we're seeing today, this is actually kind of a weird one because, well, first off, it's probably fine because it's most likely just going to be the usual thing that the bank shareholders get wiped out. Well, actually, that was the thing that was really messed up in the Great Recession is the AIG shareholders got to keep their equity. It's like, screw those guys. But generally speaking, when the government steps in to fix a crisis, it just says, well, we'll backstop everything, and very rarely has to pay out on that. And when it does take stuff over, it often makes a massive profit. Actually, the federal government made a profit off the troubled asset relief program, because when no one has any money and you're the only one buying, you often get good deals on everything, especially if you're the one who goes in and fixes it and improves their value, which is what the federal government is generally doing. So the current set of banking crises, it looks like this is weirdly dumb. That like there was no sophisticated anything going on here. It was just a total lack of just really basic risk management. That banks just bought way too many long-term treasuries. That was it. That was the whole problem. They bought a whole lot of long-term treasuries, and then interest rates went up, and oops, we're insolvent. And this sort of is reinforcing lessons of the past, but even more so, because there is the thing that was learned after Lehman Brothers. It was we can just let a bank go under and the markets will figure out how to audit banks and stuff in the future. That's not what happened. And this time it's reinforcing it even more, because Silicon Valley Bank, it was unusual in that it had very sophisticated depositors. And it turns out when you have very sophisticated depositors, instead of them auditing the bank and insisting it clean up its act, they just have a really, really fast bank run.
Basically, yeah.
It's like, okay, I think trying to let the market correct this is going to make the problem worse, actually. There's a few things going on here. Fundamentally, there's way too much credit going on all over the place.
Yes.
That you have these things where just for the sake of the mechanics of making payments, there's credit lines happening everywhere. And that's not good. But if you're going to have that, if you need that, then you have these like trusted parties everywhere. And the system works a lot better if these are properly audited, and there's an Uncle Sam can come in and shut them down and wash out shareholders the instant they become insolvent.
Right.
And if you don't have that, that's very bad. And then I have to say, I feel bad for anyone running the Federal Reserve, because you're always the bad guy, right? Yeah. Like interest rates too low, you're causing hyperinflation. Oh my God. Interest rates too high, you're making the banks go under. Oh my God. Like it's like there's no.
Yeah, it's not a very good place to be in, I'll tell you that much.
Yeah. There's no winning there. They're always the bad guy, no matter what happens. However, what we're seeing now, hopefully, fingers crossed, is the Federal Reserve doing what they should. They come in, they wash out the shareholders, they backstop everything. No one loses their deposits, and everything's fine. So, and one hopes that banks will be better run in the future.
I'd love to hope and think that. And I want to ask you, because you're talking about the centralized banking system, you're talking about the philosophies thereof that are creating banking crises that are pre-existing within our society. And I want to ask you, especially what happened in cryptocurrency in 2022 with the CeFi collapse as well, as the inevitable notion of time has pressed on, principles have appeared to change from the initial zeitgeist that once stood strong in cryptocurrency. Do you believe that a reactionary response back to the original principles of decentralization, DeFi, peer-to-peer networks, and minimal government involvement will ever occur again in blockchain, or are those kind of foregone?
Well, there's this problem. First off, people don't care about decentralization.
I know they don't.
Rich. They want to get rich,
That's
right?
True.
And so a lot of the issues are that you're not allowed to run Ponzi schemes, right? There are rules against doing that. You're not allowed to do pump and dumps where you make a worthless thing and then you tell everyone it's a great investment and sell them on it and dump your bags and get out. And there are rules against doing this, but everyone decided, oh, well, Bitcoin sort of kind of looks like it's doing this, and it's not a security. It's somehow dodging this. So I'll just claim that what I'm doing has the same excuse of the rules not applying. And then just went ahead and did what people have always done. Of doing pump and dumps and dumping their bags. And some of the VCs who are most obnoxious about talking about fair distribution are the most egregious pump and dumpers, because
Of
The
course.
Bill Cosby school of making people think that you're a good person. The uh, the um, so that's kind of a problem. That, like I said, there's these basic things of security and stuff that people are not interested in building. They want to build Ponzi schemes. They want to get rich. I think there's a real market for real security, and we're working towards providing tools for that, which is a matter of, number one, actually building the tools properly, and then number two, getting the appropriate people actually interested in using them. And often you have, network effects issues here. It's hard to have a payment system with not enough people using it. And
Of
in
course.
particular, there's a pretty bad impedance mismatch between traditional banking and cryptocurrency, because in traditional banking, you have all these credit relationships everywhere, which is good and bad. It's good because you could just send and receive payments without having to fund it beforehand, but it's bad because it's a tremendous cost drain on the system and makes it very hard to work with other people because you have to trust whoever you're interacting with. And is the reason for all these like tremendous regulatory regimes and all that stuff through the whole system. In a crypto payment channel network, you have to pre-fund everything. And there's questions about how you get liquidity providing and things like that. Although right now it's mostly suffering from network effects. There's just not enough people using it. So in terms of things to actually get people to use, right? Chia's big push right now is around carbon credit tokenization. The idea being that it should be that for all the high quality carbon credits in the world, their eventual resting place is they're represented on chain on Chia, where there are liquid markets in trading these things. And again, really, really basic functionality. The Chia asset token standard has the feature that you can do swaps within it with no trusted intermediary between them. That one person wants to trade this amount of Chia for this amount of this type of carbon credit. Someone else wants to take the other side of that. They can just go ahead and do it. And the only thing adjudicating this is the blockchain itself.
Right.
Letting it through with no need for a trusted intermediary through it. You can have trusted intermediaries to help with speed and yada, 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 but it helps with a very liquid market. Now this,
of course,
this is great. This is really basic functionality, important things that the world needs. Especially because there's a lot of issuers of high quality carbon credits, a lot of countries, they can do whatever they want, but they don't trust other countries to run their stuff. They don't want one particular blessed firm being the only place you can do trades, because that place would be taking too much off the top. Yes. But there's a lot of work involved in making this happen in terms of you have to get things on chain. You want to kind of figure out which carbon credits are reasonably comparable with each other, have auditing going on through the whole thing. So we're working on these just very, very basic building tools to do this. And there's a whole stack of things that are important to getting this done, starting with, at the very most basic level, having a blockchain that you can actually trust.
Of course, absolutely.
like having having a consensus algorithm, which, well, first off, isn't burning lots of power, because that's very bad for any green project. But then also, on top of that, does have the property that it is a legitimately secure distributed database. And like proof of stake systems are a tremendous step backwards on that one. And anything that does like massive hard forks routinely and shows, well, we can just change the rules whenever we feel like it. That's not confidence inspiring. And then on top of that, there's the on-chain programming environment, where Solidity is, bad JavaScript. And it's terrifying. Like people lose ungodly amounts of money to just outright hacks because there were bugs in things. And that happens because it's a programming environment that's not appropriate for handling these amounts of money. And so for Chia, from the ground up, Chia Lisp is designed to be reliable and auditable and meant to be something that's appropriate for something that's consensus critical and really, really needs tremendous trust in what it's doing. And on top of that is really good extensibility and interoperability built into it as well.
So let me ask you then, like because you bring up Chia and you bring up the intricacies of carbon credits and you have to have a trustworthy blockchain, and I agree with you 100%. In 2017, when you went on to found Chia alongside Gene Hoffman, like what was the main reason you decided to create Chia, and what issues and dilemmas within the realm of blockchain did you empirically recognize that you believe Chia can fix?
Oh, well, there's a certain amount of when you're the best in the world at something, and there's some part of it that's important, you kind of get dragged into it.
I can imagine.
So there was a lot of that going on. I really did want to make a better consensus algorithm, both in terms of reducing power consumption and then also being yet even more secure and decentralized than Bitcoin is. And we've done that in terms of having greater Nakamoto coefficient, arguably greater cost to actually attack it. But definitely, Chia is extremely secure and doing so on a budget much lower than what Bitcoin is spending and in ways that are going to improve yet even more in the future as the people get more accustomed to taking drives that they're currently shredding and instead just repurposing them to farming. Is what happens to old drives. So I wanted to improve on these things. And so I had this general sketch of, we'll do proofs of space and time. And then I had much vaguer ideas about what to actually do with it. I'm like, we'll make a better on-chain programming environment, whatever that means. I don't know what that means. I was very steeped in Bitcoin. Like Chia is very, very much based off of Bitcoin experiences everywhere. It's in the CoinSet model, which is based off the UTXO model. And, it has a real Nakamoto consensus underlying it. It's very much in that vein everywhere. But I think it's fair to say that I was motivated by building a better engine. And at the time, I didn't yet have great plans for what to do on top of it. And I would just ask people, okay, what are the good smart contracts? Like just tell me what's a smart contract that isn't just yet another Ponzi scheme. Tell me something that isn't done here. And, and I wasn't joking, and people thought I was being a sarcastic jerk. I'm like, no, I'm not kidding. Actually, I'm just really, I really want to know. So somebody tell me what's worth building.
So what made you then, because you outlined, the Bitcoin proof of work UTXO model, and you outlined before about the issues surrounding proof of stake consensus mechanisms. And I'm curious to hear, since, as blockchain technology has evolved since its inception, we've seen many different consensus mechanisms come alive and come around. And tell us why you decided to introduce a new consensus paradigm in Chia known as proof of stake.
So first off, almost everything is not new. So basically everything, the vast majority, effectively everything that people propose either degenerates into normal proof of work and you're just burning power on ASICs, or it's just kind of obfuscated proof of stake. And often if it's obfuscated proof of stake, it's bad proof of stake. And even the good proof of stake isn't very good. It's a step backwards. The whole reason Bitcoin did well was because it wasn't proof of stake. That people had been trying to build decent proof of stake systems for a long time before that, and always just wound up being totally centralized and falling apart. So you get this like plateau of functionality that most of Chia's consensus algorithm related code is replacing one line of code in Bitcoin. It's like that. It's just on a purely technical level. It's extremely difficult to get away from things degenerating into proof of work. So you have this problem of like, well, how do you stop grinding attacks? And the Bitcoin answer is, well, you don't. Grinding is just what you do. That's just the way it works. You get rewarded for grinding. It's fair, right? And that does work to its credit. It definitely results in a secure distributed database. But it's really hard to get away from that. It's because if you want to make it so that you don't just have grinding everywhere, you have to make it so that not only do you not need to do grinding, but you can't even benefit from grinding if you're clever and try doing it on purpose. And in order to make that work, I first had to figure out, oh, well, we need to mix together proof of space and proof of time, right? That proof of space is something meaningfully different because unlike almost everything like computational, space is extremely commodity. You just have hard drives, right? You can't make a better ASIC proof of space thing. We have those. They're called hard drives. They're called SSDs. That's what they are. And bits are bits. All of them just store bits. That's all the exact same thing. Mm-hmm. And so you have that tremendous benefit that you can actually use normal commodity things, even things that are garbage, that are unreliable and getting thrown out, or things that are provisioned but not being used yet, to leverage for the security of the system. And then on top of that, and so that's something that's sort of meaningfully different from anything computation based. And then in order to make that actually work, there's this kind of subtle point that you need to mix it in with proofs of time. Mm-hmm. And then there's a question of how you stitch them together. So when I started the whole thing, I had this plan of, well, we're going to have proofs of space and proofs of time. And so, well, we need to invent proofs of space because the one we have doesn't really work right. And we need to invent proofs of time because they don't exist yet. And maybe we need to figure out a way of actually stitching them together that doesn't suck. But I'll figure it out later. So that was the plan. I'm always telling people, whatever you do, don't have invent new math here anywhere on your product roadmap. And I'm a total hypocrite. But I got away with it. So,
So let me ask you this then. We're surrounding Chia because it seems like Chia embodies the principles of what Satoshi Nakamoto set forth surrounding Bitcoin's notion of decentralization towards peer-to-peer transactions. And if I were to ask you this then, how does Chia truly embody the principles of decentralization, as Satoshi once said, one CPU, one vote?
Oh, well, that's very easy because it doesn't work out that way, of course. He literally said one CPU, one vote in his thing. He's like, one IP address, one vote doesn't work, but maybe one CPU, one vote works. And he had this idea that, well, we have this tremendous sunk cost into building all these CPUs and they're sitting around bored, not doing anything most of the time. So we can leverage those. And that was a nice thought. In practice, it hasn't worked out that way, right? Like it's not like in practice, what happens is you have custom ASICs, not general purpose CPUs, and they're in very specific facilities that happen to have cheap power right there and burn tons of power doing this. And it's a fairly centralized thing. It's gone up and down in its level of centralization. But so it's like, well, how about if instead of, one CPU, one vote, it's 1 terabyte, one vote, right? I think that's getting into what was actually wanted here was we just have these things sitting around already. We could just use them that makes things more secure. So it is very much in that vein, like just very directly going after what Satoshi wanted there and doing it quite successfully, empirically in the real world. It's much higher Nakamoto coefficient doing this than you get out of a proof of work system. It's funny because I like to think, I'm glad you have some inkling that this really is very much in the vein of Bitcoin, just taking the whole thing even further in that direction of what was being gone for. Because of course, Bitcoin maxis hate me.
I can imagine. Bitcoin maxis are, I'll tell you, many of them that I've met, unfortunately, are some of the most tribalistic people in this entire space.
Yeah, extremely so. And of course, I'm a criminal because I have done something to defame Bitcoin in the process of doing stuff. And it's weird because they flip-flop back and forth between saying, no, Bitcoin is better than everything else and saying, no, ossification is good. It's like, well, which is it? Their usual talking point is like solidity is garbage, which is true. Solidity is garbage. But if you compare like Bitcoin script and Chia Lisp, now this is not a fair comparison. One of them was written years after the other one was with an extended period of development, having like extensive knowledge of the corpus of academic and practical work that had been done on top of the existing thing. But Chia Lisp just beats Bitcoin script in a blowout, just clearly superior, just in a very apples to apples way. If you're starting a new system, obviously you start with Chia Lisp, not Bitcoin script. And Bitcoin maxis just don't know what to say that.
And on the topic of Chia, we actually have a question here, a $10 super chat. Thank you. Sasquatch asks, could you please explain how the Chia coin ties into Chia as a company and vice versa?
Okay, so there's the Chia blockchain, right, which can chug along without us. Like the Chia, the company, is not necessary for Chia, the blockchain, to an ecosystem to continue to function. Right? Now, if we all disappeared, there would be a lot less development going on. But it would continue to exist. It very much would continue to exist. There might be a few hiccups where people start running some new trackers and things like that, but it would definitely continue to work. So Chia, the company, created the code base and the standard and all that stuff, and acts as kind of a point of coordination of enhancements, both in terms of improving the general software that runs it, writing new applications on top of it, really kind of reference versions of them for other people to use mostly, and also coordinating enhancements to the whole thing. Generally speaking, soft forks. And the business model for this, there's actually a few business models for it, but the most obvious one is there's a pre-farm. There's just a bunch of Chia that we have that's sitting in our vault. And we're not touching that. We're not moving it. At some point in the future, distant future, we'll leverage that in some way. But we're being very careful about it right now because it would be very easy to run afoul of rules against unlicensed securities if we sold any of it. So we've only raised money via normal equity raises thus far. We're kind of a boring normal company. But basically, it's like Chia Chia the company owns a bunch of Chia the tokens and is in the business of enhancing things, improving it, and does everything open source, almost everything open source, aside from just some our internal, we don't open source all of our internal operational things, but very much an open source company. And yeah, have the model and incentive of just promoting Chia generally and making it better.
There you go. And on the topic of community questions, I actually had someone DM me last night and wanted me to ask you this question. Do you believe that Bitcoin's name itself was named after BitTorrent or BitConjurer, both or neither?
Well, BitConjurer was my old domain.
Yeah, that's why he asked. That's why he asked.
No, it was. Well, he mentioned BitTorrent in the original white paper, I believe.
Yes.
And like he used BitTorrent all the time. He would sit there on IRC chatting with people and torrenting things with them. So it was likely also someone I knew. But no, it's not like a conspiracy theory or anything. It was like an overt homage. I don't think there was any secret.
That's awesome that you knew, that you may possibly have known him.
People it was likely to be kind of died in horrible ways, and it's a little traumatizing.
I can imagine. Sorry to hear that. I can imagine.
Yeah.
So Bram, my last question to you, and the one last thing I just want to ask the community here. So there's 60 people watching. Please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Make sure to follow Bram on Twitter. Make sure to follow Chia on Twitter. Make sure to follow Gene Hoffman on Twitter. I have all of these links in the description. So make sure to follow this project, as it does embody the principles of what cryptocurrency should stand for. So all I want to ask you, Bram, now for the my last question for you, because I don't want to take up too much of your time. We often overestimate the change in civilization over the next 2 years and underestimate the change in civilization over the next 10.
Yeah.
Surrounding this notion, where do you believe cryptocurrency and blockchain technology will be by the end of the decade? And where would you like to see yourself, Chia, and BitTorrent by the end of the decade, more specifically?
Well, yeah, the end of the decade is really far off.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So in terms of my general roadmap, right, there's these things of having, like I said, the carbon credits, having those be tokenized on chain as a standard. That's where all the carbon credits go. It's a very liquid market, like at least a bunch of other things there. having a whole bunch of it being a standard business thing, that when a business has information that they're reporting that's of interest to people who might want to do commerce based off of that information, they just post it on chain so that people can make offers for things based off of that. That's the data layer project that we have that is part of what we're doing already. But that's probably going to be a thing that companies just sort of do reflexively as like a normal thing that obviously you do. Having a whole lot of like real banks and banking processes that are actually using like real custody arrangements that we have for securing of actual things, because they're actually good going on with it. Likely a fair amount of, actually the thing I'm least confident in is having a robust payment network on it where people are just doing normal vanilla payments through it all the time. Because that requires such network effects to really get going. I'm doing on-chain gaming right now that I'm implementing, so that will awesome. Be up and running, and there will be possibly in the field of games like poker, it'll just be the norm that you play directly against other people, not with like a casino in the middle going between you. It may be something that, there's a communication point that you're likely going through, but not a casino. So I'm in the process of building that right now. Yeah, that's a whole lot of our legacy code base should be long since improved by then. Always working on improving stuff. Yeah, I think that's quite a bit of really ambitious stuff there already, just in those things. Although it's like really basic stuff. It's like just doing the fundamentals, like just start there. And a lot of things that people think are really sophisticated are really just obfuscation of Ponzi schemes. And we're not doing that. It's like, no, how do we make just normal basic commerce work better? How do we get normal payments to involve public key cryptography? Like that's like getting back to things that should have been done 20 years ago that people should have been losing their minds weren't done already.
Absolutely.
Instead, we have to build this like rocket to the moon in order to get people to do it.
Absolutely. So all I want to say, Bram, to conclude is I really appreciate the hour that you've spent with me. I know how busy of a man you are. I know how much you've achieved, and it's an honor to speak with you. And I know that you're very selective on coming on streams, and I don't blame you. And I want to thank you again for coming on. And it would be an honor to have you on sometime in the future. Again, it was a really pleasant conversation. You have a fantastic community behind you. And I want to thank you for all you've done in facilitating what cryptocurrency and what decentralization and what self-sovereignty means in the digital world today. You played a massive, but you still do play a massive part in that political, social, and cultural internet zeitgeist.
Yeah. Well, yeah, this has been great. Thank you. It's so rare that I'm on an interview which isn't at least a little bit hostile.
No. I have no hostility. Is not a. It's not a particular. It's not a cordial way of creating a sense of relationship with someone. It's not my shtick. So yeah. I want to say again, thank you so much for your time, guys. Make sure to go in the description and follow Bram on Twitter. Make sure to follow Chia on Twitter. Make sure to like this video and share this video if you find it valuable. Make sure to subscribe. And most importantly, I want to thank my guest, Bram. Thank you for all that you've done, and thank you for all that you do.
Thank you so much. This was fun.
Absolutely. I'll be right back. Thank you so much, guys. Give me 1 second.